May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Again, welcome to everyone here, and a special welcome to any guests we have. Welcome to all of you listening online. Who do you admire? What qualities do you most admire about them? My mother is a person I admire. And one of the qualities I most admired is that she knew what was important to her. She used to say, "My children are my jewels," and she meant it. She knew what she treasured, and she was a content and caring person. Jesus often urges us to think about what it is we treasure. And in today's gospel, he urges his followers not to put their trust in goods, but to be rich in God, those things that draw us closer to God. Through a parable about greed, Jesus says, our character matters. We need to focus on developing a God-centered character in order for God to use us in the world. The parable of the rich fool found in Luke is in the wisdom tradition. And there's a whole section of the Bible called wisdom literature, which includes Psalms and Proverbs. Wisdom teachings often focus on how to live a good life. It's practical wisdom that brings us closer to God. In the ancient world, there was a strong interest in character. Plato and Aristotle thought of character in terms of moral excellence. They believed that character shaped actions and that only someone with a good character could perform good actions. They spent a lot of time considering what is a good character by examining vices and virtues. For example, in Greece, heroism was highly valued. That meant the virtue of courage was important. Aristotle believed a virtue to be a middle ground between two vices. For example, courage was a mean between recklessness and cowardice. The early Christians called vices sins. And the first written list of the 7 deadly sins, not the first sin, is attributed to a monk in the 4th century. The great writer Dante used the 7 deadly sins as the structure of his story poems. And he also saw things similarly to Aristotle. He saw greed as two-pronged. On one end was lavish spending, and on the other was miserliness. But what about in our day? Do we take much interest in developing a good character or interest in virtues? Imagine someone coming to America from another world and trying to figure out what's important in our culture. If they only learned our values through some of the media, they might think that fame, notoriety, ruthlessness, violence, financial success, and having lots of stuff are of prime importance. I often see Amazon trucks on the highway saying, "Warning, contents may cause happiness." And it's as if more stuff is going to bring us happiness. And please know, I'm not against Amazon. They come to my house also. A recent philosopher, Alasdair MacIntyre, believed our culture did not think about virtues enough. And one of his books is called After Virtue. It asks, how do we live in a culture that seems to have forgotten character ideals and virtues? MacIntyre believes our moral discussions are too individualistic and not guided by rational thought. One of his answers is to return to virtues, but virtues that uphold the common good. I'm really oversimplifying MacIntyre's book, but I find the title provocative. It urges us to think about what specific virtues are important to us, and more importantly, why or for what end. Just as a side note, MacIntyre converted to Catholicism later in his life. In today's gospel, Jesus is right in the middle of a serious teaching session when someone interrupts him with a personal request. Jesus, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me. This is one of those great moments in the Bible where it's easy to see Jesus' humanity. His response seems a lot like ours if we're interrupted, a little irritated, a little impatient. Who set me to be judge and arbitrator over you? But being a great teacher, Jesus takes this individual request as a jumping off point to address the larger and more universal character quality of greed. What do you think of when you hear the word greed? What pops into your mind? I'm not asking you to write it down. It's not a test. I posed this question to a few friends, and it was fascinating how varied the answers were. There was consensus that greed is wanting more than we need. But more of what? Greed can mean wanting more goods, more material goods than we need. Greed can mean wanting more and more money. It might mean not wanting to share something, even though we have plenty. Greed can mean being dissatisfied, even though we have enough. The dictionary says greed is an obsession with accumulating material goods. Thomas Aquinas thought greed was an excessive desire for control. Some say greed is an insatiable or selfish desire for things both tangible and intangible. Food, money, land, possessions, power, social status, fame, and the like. In today's gospel, greed is portrayed in a form that I'd call stockpiling. The rich fool not only stockpiles, but he even has to build bigger and better barns to do so. During COVID, people stockpiled a lot, and they stockpiled toilet paper in a major way, even fighting over it. I could never figure out why toilet paper, and I'm sure Freud would have something interesting to say about it. Now, food, I can understand. I stashed away more canned goods than I needed. During COVID, we had a perfect example of what happens when a lot of people stockpile. It leads to scarcity for many others. In the parable, greed is portrayed as an undesirable character trait that one should avoid. That seems pretty obvious. Greed harms the rich fool by drawing him away from God. The harm of individual greed is the stuff of many stories and movies. And it can be satisfying to see a ruthless Wall Street leader brought down by greed. But these stories often tend to exaggerate and make the rich person very, very rich and the miserly person very, very miserly, and not much like those of us average persons. But that's different from the story that Jesus tells today. In his parable, the man is neither really bad or really good. He is simply foolish. The man just happens to get a bigger crop. He doesn't seek it out. But the windfall puts him in a position to have to choose what to do with it. He has an inner dialogue with his soul. And the word soul is important here. It indicates the man is considering the best course for his life or soul. He chooses to store grain and goods and to eat, drink, and be merry. I can't condemn this man. I often think some of the same thoughts. The future is uncertain, and having something to fall back on isn't a bad thing. We all need money for homes, food, medical care, our children, and so on. Pastor Fred Craddock says, this parable points out the failure to see the distinction between what one is and what one has. God says, you fool, because the man has chosen only food and drink, and only to save himself. There's no discussion of his family or larger circle. God reminds the man of the transitory nature of his life and his death. Life is uncertain. There's agreement on that. But it's how the man approaches that uncertainty. He's urged to turn toward God or be rich to God. So how do we do that? It's tough in our culture, as we noticed before. Priest Robert Capon says, the world we live in, and I would have to say in our country, runs on greed. It's hard in our culture not to get caught up in it. Greed is kind of sneaky. But Jesus continually advocates focusing on love for God and love for others. We do that through cultivating Christ-like virtues of kindness and gratitude for what we do have. Gratitude and thanksgiving to God can do wonders. As we turn more towards God, we're able to share some of our power. We're able to share more of everything. Power, possessions, food, money, or love with less anxiety and fear. Practicing virtues is good for our personal character. But Jesus' teaching also reminds us that our individual character has an impact on those around us. And I'd like to leave you with a visual image of how individual persons can transform not only their own lives, but those of others, when heading in the direction of Christ's love. Recently, I saw a compelling movie about how England became more fully involved in World War II, called The Darkest Hour. It was set in late 1939 and 1940. Hitler and his leaders were the epitome of greed. Greed for personal power, greed for power over other nations, greed for the power of life and death over unwanted peoples, and greed for other countries' resources. Even though England had already declared war with Germany after they invaded Poland, tensions in Parliament ran high. Some of its leaders still believed a peace pact might be possible. It's understandable. Who really wants war in one's own country? But along with other leaders, Winston Churchill could see Hitler's ruthless greed. He had already taken over Lithuania, Austria, and Poland when the movie begins. Germany is in the process of taking over Belgium, and France is greatly at risk. Churchill did not believe Hitler could be trusted or peace was possible with such a leader. Churchill was an unlikely person to become prime minister in 1940. He was in the same political party as those advocating peace with Hitler. He was 76 years old and not in the greatest of health. And in World War I, he was blamed for losing many soldiers in the Battle of Gallipoli. But risking the possibility of not being chosen prime minister, Churchill spoke the truth of what he saw. He urged England to support France and their allies and to stop Hitler's hate-filled regime. A critical turning point in Churchill's early leadership was the retreat at the Battle of Dunkirk. English troops were outnumbered and surrounded in France, and the two countries were unable to stop the German armies. There was a humanitarian need to rescue soldiers and a need to preserve the French and English armies if there was going to be any hope for the future. A retreat was planned for Dunkirk, a port in France. The larger English ships were already too far out at sea, and there were only small military vessels left to cross the English Channel. A help cry was broadcast directly to the English people, asking anyone with boats to aid in the rescue. 700 little boats, civilian boats of all sizes, sailed to Dunkirk. And because of the bravery and courage of all who went there, 338 soldiers were rescued. It was considered a miracle. It's the image of all those little boats sailing bravely toward Dunkirk, towards a common good, that I'd like to leave with you today. For me, it's an image of a life of faith. We are like those little boats, rowing, sailing, or motoring towards God. We set out trying to be the best persons that we can be. And as we keep holding our course towards God, we're able to trust that the efforts of our little lives will be taken up by God, blessed and multiplied into God's greater purposes. God can and does use our lives to create more love, joy, peace, kindness, and goodness in the world. Amen.